Hello, everyone. So I'm trying to do the first lecture of Unit 3. And this topic will be on blood pressure and blood pressure regulation. I am going to share my screen with you. First, we're going to go through the slides I have, and then I'll use the whiteboard to explain the regulation mechanisms. Okay, so let's see. Let's see if I could get it. Alrighty. So let's start from the beginning. Let's see. Hopefully you can see the screen here. Let's see. Oops. That's not what I want. Okay. So we're talking about the blood flow and the blood pressure regulation. The materials are in your book from page 714 to page 723. You should read your book first, have a quick reading, and then watch this video, and then review the materials, and then work on the assignments, which I will tell you later. Okay, so let's talk about the blood flow. Blood flow is the blood volume going through a vessel or an organ or the entire circulation in a given period. So if you think about cardiac output, if you remember, the cardiac output is the blood volume going through one side of the heart in 1 minute. So if we say, if we use the cardiac output, we can use that as blood flow in 1 minute through the systemic circulation. All right, so in that case, we can say blood flow equals the cardiac output. All right, that is the blood flow in 1 minute through the systemic circulation. Okay, why do we need to do to have the cardiovascular regulation? Because we want to maintain stable capillary blood flow in the peripheral system. The reason for that is we know capillary sites are the only sites that we can have gas and material exchanges. So it is very critical we maintain stable blood pressure among all capillaries, so we can have regular gas and material exchanges. So next question is, what mechanisms, what are the main factors regulate blood flow through all different vessels? Okay, this diagram, you do have this in your book, kind of give you an idea that the regulation of blood flow can be regulated by regulating the blood pressure in different types of vessels, and also by regulation of the cardiac output. So the regulation can be neuroregulation, can be hormonal regulation. All right, so blood flow definitely closely related to blood pressure. So you can think that higher blood pressure definitely will give higher or faster blood flow. So the blood pressure regulation is what we're going to focus on the next. Okay, blood pressure, first the arterial blood pressure. There's some terms you need to know. Systemic pressure is the highest pressure against the arterial wall during the ventricular contraction. And diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure during the ventricular dilation. And the pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. But I want you to pay attention to this one, the mean arterial pressure. This is a very important functional term here, mean arterial pressure. This is the pressure actually required to maintain stable blood flow. This pressure, to calculate this pressure, we use the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. The reason for that, okay, let me show you this diagram. Okay, on this diagram, you can see on the y-axis is the pressure changes. And you can see the highest one definitely is the systolic pressure. The lowest one here is the diastolic pressure. If we use this two number, the difference between these two numbers will be the mean arterial, the pulse pressure. Okay, the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure is the pulse pressure. But the actual pressure which can keep the blood flow smoothly is called the mean arterial pressure, because the diastolic pressure part takes longer than the systolic pressure going up. See this curve, you see the coming down here, the slope is not as steep as the systolic going up. So we cannot just simply use the pulse pressure as the pressure to measure the blood flow. So instead, we use the mean arterial pressure. That means the diastolic pressure kind of weigh a little bit more on this. Another word to say that is the mean arterial, the pressure regulates the blood flow, is more, is closer to the diastolic part than to the systolic part. Okay, so now let's look at this diagram. You can see on the pink side, representing the blood pressure changes among different sized arteries, from big to small to the smallest. Okay, see, you can see the pressure changes, the range for pressure changes decreases because the wall is getting thinner and thinner. All right. Once you see connected to the smallest arteries, that's arterioles. Here, this purple part is the capillaries. Once the blood vessels get to this range, the vessel wall is only one layer of squamous cells. So there's no room for expanding and recoiling. So the pressure around the capillaries has to be much, much lower than the arteries. Okay, so the capillaries do not have the capacity to expand and recoil like the big arteries can absorb pressure and release pressure. The capillaries cannot. All right, so the pressure, number one, in the capillaries are much lower. Number two, if you see the pressure changes, this point is the beginning of the capillary. This is the end of the capillary. So at the beginning of the capillary, the blood pressure is around 40. At the end of capillary, the blood pressure is around 20. So the difference, the pressure difference is still pretty dramatic. You know, the slope is still pretty steep. So because of that, blood can still smoothly flow from this higher pressure point to the lower pressure point. Okay, that is important. So we want to keep this pressure differences, from 40 to 20. At the same time, maintain this pressure in the capillaries to allow blood continue to flow, to allow the materials exchange continues. All right, so this is the slide I was just talking about. Okay, in the capillary side, we need to maintain the pressure differences to allow good material exchanges. If we look at the vein side here, from the smallest vein to the biggest vein, you see if we use the same pattern starting at this venous starting point here, end point here, there's still some pressure differences. So the blood can flow from this higher pressure point to this lower pressure point. But if you look at the vena cava, the big vessel here, okay, the beginning and the end, the pressure difference is very, very small, all right? Because the pressure difference is very small, and plus the gravity we have to overcome, it is hard to push all the blood back to the heart. So we do need to have extra help. We were talking about something like muscular pump, or the respiratory pump, the diaphragm works to help, and also exercises, constrict your blood, skeletal muscles, which will help the blood return. Yeah, the reason we need to have these extra helps because the venous, the blood pressure in the big veins are small, okay? The pressure difference is small in the big veins. Okay, so to maintain blood pressure, we have to regulate, we have to have regulation mechanisms, all right? These mechanisms are involved in the heart, the vessels, and the kidneys, and also the brain, of course. So we'll look at the mechanisms in a minute. So here I give you a overview. If we talk about the blood pressure regulation, usually we're talking about the resistance, the total peripheral resistance, okay? And the vessel elasticity, the cardiac output, the blood volume, all these factors are involved in blood pressure regulation. We're going to go over these one at a time. We can skip this for now. Okay, so let's look at the blood pressure regulation. The regulation, in general, we can divide it in two big arms. One is called the short-term regulation, which will focus on the resistance regulation. And the long-term regulation will focus on the blood volume regulation. Okay, so in general, if you think about it, if you increase the resistance, that is the forces that are the forces against the blood flow. So if you increase the total resistance, and you're going to increase the blood pressure to keep the stable blood flow. Does that make sense? Yeah. To maintain a good flow, okay, if the resistance is higher, then you have to have higher pressure, okay? The next part, the volume. The more of the blood volume, the higher the blood pressure. Also, there are like a second by second regulation on the side, constantly on the capillary side. It's called autoregulation. If you can recall what we talked about capillary beds, we said in each capillary beds, many of the capillaries, they have sphincters, which can actively regulating how much blood flow through that capillary bed. That is an example of autoregulation. And for short-term and long-term regulation, I am going to use the whiteboard to explain the mechanisms. All right, so I'm going to change the screen here. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Let me find my whiteboard. Here we go. We got the whiteboard. Okay, so first let's just review about blood flow. Okay, which is related to the two big factors. One is the difference of pressure between 2 points. Another one is the total resistance. Okay, this R is resistance, total resistance. So if we say, if we want to maintain the blood flow, okay, maintain the blood flow. If you increase the resistance, then you have to increase blood pressure to maintain the stable blood flow. Okay, do we understand this? All right, okay. Now, then we can say blood flow. If we say it is the blood going through the systemic circulation in 1 minute, through the heart on one side, then it's cardiac output. So we can say cardiac output related to the pressure and the total resistance. Total resistance, okay? So if we talk about the blood pressure regulation, we can kind of change this formula a little bit. Then it's cardiac output and resistance on this side. Okay, basically this formula tells you pressure is related to these two big factors, either output or the resistance, okay? And then we know the cardiac output equals to what, everyone? Stroke volume times heart rate. Yes? And then the next one is, again, this is the resistance. Okay, so if we talk about the blood pressure regulation, we can look at either the stroke volume, the heart rate, and resistance changes. Okay, that is the pressure regulation. So this is a quick review, and let me see if I can clear, no, if I can clear my drawing. Yes, okay. Now we can talk about the actual mechanisms. Second. Okay, all right, let me redo this one here. Pressure related to cardiac output and resistance. Okay, so pressure can be regulated either by regulating output or by regulating resistance. Okay, so let's say what factors can change the resistance? What did I say? Resistance here. If you can think of anything, which is the force against the blood flow. So I would say first the vessel diameters. Okay, the smaller the tubular size, the bigger the resistance. Does that make sense? Okay, so first will be the diameter. Number two is called what is it? Okay, first is the diameter change, okay? And then we have the vessel elasticity changes, can change the resistance, okay? And also, okay, let's just look at these two first. All right, first the diameter. What factors can change vessel diameters? Okay, number one, all right, number one is sympathetic nerves, right? Sympathetic nerves will make smooth muscle contraction stronger, smooth muscle contraction stronger to decrease diameter of the blood vessels. Does that make sense? Okay, so there is a formula here tell you the relationship between the resistance related to the radius of the diameter of the vessels. So resistance varies inversely with the fourth power of the vessel radius. This little r is the radius of the vessel. This tell you, okay, the bigger the radius of the vessel, the lower the resistance, and the relationship is inversely with the fourth power of the radius. So let me give you an example. If you double the radius size of this particular vessel, then the resistance will decrease 16 times. That's why, because it's the fourth power. If you double the radius, resistance drop 16 times, okay? So now you can understand the teeny tiny bit change in the vessel size has a dramatic effect on the total resistance. Okay, so that's the first thing. The sympathetic innervation can change the vessel, can change the diameter. Okay, number two is there's some chemicals called vasoconstrictors. Okay, these vasoconstrictors like norepinephrine, you already know, and vasopressin. Have you heard about this before? It's just some chemicals. It's vasopressin. And another one is called angiotensin 2. Maybe you heard about these. These are just the chemical substances which can cause vasocontraction. All right. So if vessel contracted, then the diameter will change and then the resistance will change. Okay, so the next thing, this is number two. Okay, let's continue. So see here. Okay, first is the sympathetic innervation. Second is the vasoconstrictors. constrictors, chemicals. The third one is the blood viscosity, how thick the blood is. Okay, the thicker the blood, the bigger the resistance. Like say, if you have like a syrup kind of blood running instead of your regular watery blood running, so you can understand that the resistance for the thicker blood will have more resistance. So this one, the good example will be blood doping. If you heard about that, some athletes, they like to do that to increase red blood cell counts so they can carry more oxygen, so they have more power. But this blood doping is a bad idea because if you put more blood cells into your blood circulation, that will increase the blood viscosity. And then you have to increase blood pressure to maintain the stable blood flow. Then if you have a higher blood pressure, of course, you have a higher risks to get a stroke, to rupture blood vessels. Okay, so that is number 3. And number 4, for changing diameter, for changing resistance, the last one is the vessel length. Okay, so here we go. The longer the vessel, total vessel length, the higher the resistance. Increase the length, increase resistance. Okay, so let me give you an example. There's a research show that if someone increase 5 pounds more body fat, not just weight, okay, 5 pounds more body fat, then the blood vessels have to increase at least 1 mile longer to maintain the blood supply to all these fat cells, okay? So the longer the length, vessel length, the higher the resistance, then the higher pressure to maintain the flow. So this is why higher blood pressure is a common problem associated with obesity. Okay, so let's review this we just talked about, okay? Peripheral resistance can be regulated by changing vessel diameters, okay? Vessel diameters can be changed by 4 different main factors. Number 1 is a sympathetic regulation. Number 2 is the vasoconstrictors. Number 3 is the blood viscosity. Number 4 is the total vessel length. Okay, so that's the first big factor, diameter change the peripheral resistance. Okay, now the next one is changing vessel elasticity can lead to change of total resistance. Okay, so elasticity is how good the vessel can comply, okay, recoil. So you probably heard about arterial sclerosis. Okay, in that case, the vessels become very rigid, okay, cannot like expand to absorb pressure and recoil to release pressure. So in this case, then the vessel will experience more pressure against the vessel wall and weaker the vessels, okay? So if you have more pressure against the wall, then the resistance increase, all right? Okay, so that's a vessel elasticity can definitely affect the resistance. Okay, all right. So let's see now. I think we're ready to talk about the mechanisms. Okay, let's talk about mechanism of blood pressure regulation. Okay, blood pressure regulation. Okay, so this one, the regulation has two arms, all right? One is called a local regulation. Okay, the other arm is called a neural hormonal regulation. Okay, so the top one, local regulation, that is the auto regulation. All right, so it's like a second by second auto intrinsic factors doing like a minor adjustments to regulate the pressure. We're going to focus on this one, okay, the neural and endocrine or hormonal regulation. So the first one is called, it's called, oh, I can have a color pencil. Oh, I did not know that. Okay, cool. Okay, the first one is a short-term regulation. Okay, this one is focused on resistance regulation. Okay, so should I clear it up? Okay, so I have more space. Okay, so short term. All right, so let's just say if the blood pressure is higher than normal, then it will trigger this short-term regulation. Okay, so first this signal, the changes will be sensed by pressure receptors. They're called baroreceptors or baroreceptors. Okay, baroreceptors. These receptors are in the big arteries, like in the common carotid arteries and in the aorta. So these pressure receptors sense the change, and then it's going to signal the centers to do the following things. Okay, so this information will be sent to the medulla oblongata. So they have centers to regulate the following. Number one is to stimulate parasympathetic nerve system. All right, so and number two is going to decrease the sympathetic nerve output. So remember, these two are kind of like most of the time is in opposite direction. If you increase the parasympathetic, then you decrease the sympathetic. Okay, so if you increase parasympathetic innervation, then think about the heart rate. The SA node. Okay, so you're going to have lower heart rate. Okay, less signal going through the heart for contraction. If you have lower heart rate, what is the effect for the output? Do you remember? Lower output. If you have lower output, then what is going to be for your blood pressure? Okay, let me remind you here. Okay, cardiac output equals to the pressure and resistance. Hold on. Okay, So blood pressure related to the cardiac output and total resistance. Okay, and output equals to stroke volume times heart rate, and then this resistance. Okay, so now we're saying parasympathetic will decrease the heart rate, then will decrease the output, then will decrease the pressure. Okay, so now you understand on this side, if you decrease the sympathetic input, then you decrease heart rate and decrease output and decrease pressure. Make sense? Okay. If you have less sympathetic innervation, what's going to happen to the vessel diameter? Okay. You're going to relax or decrease smooth muscle contraction. Then you're going to increase the vessel diameter and increase diameter, definitely decrease resistance. We talked about that, right? And then you decrease blood pressure. Huh, pretty good. Okay, all right. So this is when the blood pressure is higher. You use the short-term regulatory mechanism to lower the blood pressure. So you start with a higher blood pressure, the end is lower the blood pressure. Okay, all right. All right, we're still on the short-term regulation. Okay, short-term. Now, if blood pressure is lower, okay, you want to bring the blood pressure back up. Again, this signal will be sensed by the baroreceptors, okay? And then this one is going to send to the medulla oblongata. Number one is to inhibit the parasympathetic nerve. Number two is to stimulate the sympathetic nerve, okay? So by inhibiting parasympathetic, you already know it's going to increase the heart rate, increase output, increase pressure. All right, just opposite on the previous drawing, okay? So this increased sympathetic, definitely increase heart rate, increase output, increase pressure, okay? But activate sympathetic nerves also change, not only change the heart rate, but also change the contractility. If you remember, cardiac contractility can be changed by sympathetic nerves. So this part of sympathetic nerve will increase the contractility. If you increase contractility, then you're going to increase the stroke volume. If you increase stroke volume, you can increase output, then increase pressure. Okay, and also the sympathetic nerve stimulation will increase smooth muscle contraction, which will decrease diameter. Then, if you decrease the diameter, what's going to happen to the pressure? Okay, and one more arm here. Let me go on top, right here. Stimulate sympathetic nervous system will stimulate adrenal medulla, oops, come back, medulla. All right, so this one will increase the hormone release, norepinephrine. Okay, now you know norepinephrine. What is the effect of norepinephrine? Make a muscle contract more. Make a muscle contract more here. Contractility, okay. Change diameter. So basically very similar effect. Let's number this. This is sympathetic arm 1, arm 2, arm 3, arm 4. Okay, so increased sympathetic stimulation, you can have 4 different effects. Okay, and then we're talking about number 4, this increased sympathetic innervation can stimulate adrenal medulla to release more norepinephrine. Once you have more norepinephrine, basically you can do number 1, 2, 3 again. Same effects, okay? The first part we're talking about is the neural regulation, okay? Neural regulation. Only this number 4 arm here is hormonal regulation. But hormonal regulation, the effect is the same as the neural regulation. Okay, we're done here. Stop it, my little dog. Okay, all right, so number 2, all right, we finish with the short-term regulation. We say we focus on the resistance, the heart rate, the resistance, the heart rate, the contractility, the diameter, okay? So those are short-term. Maybe I should write it down, okay, short-term, all right, short-term regulation, all right? We focused on number 1 is the vessel diameter changes. Number 2 is the heart rate. Number 3 is the contractility, the heart muscle contractility, okay? So we focus on these things to regulate blood pressure. That's the short term, okay? The long term, that's what we're going to talk about now. Long-term regulation focus on blood volume regulation. Okay, so the main mechanism is called angiotensin. Angiotensin mechanism, okay, through kidney, okay, through let's say via renal regulation. Okay, so that's long-term regulation, all right? So let's look at the long-term regulation here. Okay, long-term regulation. Okay, so okay, let's say if you have a car accident, you lost the blood, then you have less blood volume, right? And this will be sensed by the kidney cells. All right, specifically, there's a type of cells called a juxtaglomerular cells. We'll talk about this once we get to the urinary system. So these type of cells, they can release renin. Renin is a hormone, it's a peptide-based hormone. Okay, what does the renin's function is to function as a enzyme to convert a inactive angiotensin to a active form. Okay, angiotensin 1. All right, so this is the inactive form. So normally it's inactive. Once you have renin, then renin can help to convert angiotensinogen. Sinogen, that's inactive part, okay? Renin can help to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Okay, angiotensin 1 is still not the active form. It's kind of like an intermediate form, okay? This one can be converted by another enzyme. It's called angiotensin converting enzyme, okay? 2, now you have angiotensin 2. This is the active form. This is what you want, okay? Angiotensin 2 is a very strong vasoconstrictor, okay? Constrictor, okay? So then you can change constrictor. Can you write it? Can you notice that? Okay, which can change the vessel size, right? But more importantly, angiotensin 2 can increase antidiuretic hormone release. Do you remember this hormone? By hypothalamus. Okay, if you have this one, then you're going to have more water reabsorption. If you have more water reabsorption, then you have more blood volume. More blood volume, higher blood pressure. I can't write, I don't have space to do that anymore. More blood pressure, volume, more blood pressure, okay? So that's angiotensin and 2. And then also angiotensin will stimulate aldosterone release. Do you remember aldosterone from adrenal gland? What is the function? Increase sodium reabsorption, increase water reabsorption. Okay, so arm number 1, number 2, number 3. Okay, so angiotensin 2, by increase the amount of angiotensin 2, you can increase 2 hormone release. One is antidiuretic hormone, another one is aldosterone. Both of them, the end effect is to reabsorb more water through kidneys to increase blood volume. Once you have blood volume increase, then you have blood pressure increase. That is called a long-term regulation, okay? So on the third part right here is another function of angiotensin 2, function as a vasoconstrictor to decrease vessel diameter. At the same time, you can increase pressure, like just we talked about in a short-term regulation mechanism. All right, so I talked about, well, for long-term regulation, let me just mention it. You don't need to write anything down. This angiotensin mechanism definitely is the major mechanism for long-term regulation. And also, long-term regulation involved in the blood total concentration regulation is called osmolarity regulation, osmolarity of the blood. So this regulation is through the hypothalamus. We have a thirst center in the hypothalamus. If, like say, if you had salty dinner, you're going to you want to drink more water. This part of regulation is through the hypothalamus, the thirst center. If you drink more water, then of course you're going to increase your blood volume, right? And regulate osmolarity and then increase blood pressure. So that's just a side part for the long-term regulation. All right, so normally when we talk about blood pressure regulation, if the pressure changes, all of the mechanisms are going to work together. All right, it's not just like one at a time. All of them will work together. The auto regulation is a second by second regulation. The short term regulation is faster, have the faster effect than the long-term regulation, okay? The long-term regulation focused on the blood volume regulation. All right, I think I'm going to stop for pressure regulation lecture here, okay? And there is a homework listed on Canvas under unit 3. Is called blood pressure regulation homework. So you should do that one. That should be a good review, give you some basic knowledge about blood flow and blood pressure. And then you should read your book. The pages I gave you earlier is from 714 to 723. Okay, after you did your reviews, then there is a assignment on MyLab and mastering. Okay, it's unit 3 homework 1. Okay, and then we have a computer simulated experiment. It's a Physio X. Okay, I will write you an email and list out all the work you should do after you learn the blood pressure regulation. Okay, so write down all your questions, and then on next office hour, we can talk about that. All right, let's see if I, can I stop? Oops. Okay, let's stop recording.